Will you join me in a word of prayer this morning? Oh Lord, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight. Oh Lord, our rock and our redeemer. Amen. That's a fitting prayer from the Psalms, because we've been talking about rocks being living stones for the last 3 weeks. We've been focusing on those words that come from 1 Peter chapter 2. As you come to him, the living stone, 1 Peter 2, verse 4. And then verse 5, you yourselves, like living stones, are being built up. Today, specifically, we're going to be looking at verses 9 to 10, which are the verses that you spoke in that responsive epistle reading that we shared a few minutes ago. But first of all, I want to reflect on who wrote those words for us. Those words about the living stone and about being living stones. They were written by a person who was given a nickname by Jesus, a nickname that we're all familiar with as Peter. But in Matthew chapter 16, verse 17, when Jesus gave Peter that name, he said to him, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah. For I tell you that you are Petros, and on this Petra I shall build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it." Now, in just sharing that with you, I left the part about Peter's name in the original language of the Greek of the New Testament so that you could see the connection between Peter's name, Petros, and the word Petra that comes following it. Because in the English translations, we're used to saying it, "I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church." But I want you to see the connection between those two, because Peter is just the way of saying in Greek, rock. So you are rock, and on this rock I will build my church. And it didn't matter if the people in the New Testament were speaking in Greek or if they were speaking in some other language. They knew that was Peter's nickname. Peter's nickname was rock. So, for example, the Apostle Paul, when he refers to Peter in his letters, refers to him sometimes in Aramaic. He doesn't call him Peter, but instead calls him Cephas, because Cephas is the way in Aramaic of saying rock. Now what does that mean? It means if we were to follow that convention in English and actually call Peter by his true nickname, then we wouldn't be calling Peter Peter. And we wouldn't be calling him his given name Simon either, or even Simon Peter. Instead, we would call him Rock. Or we would call him Simon Rock. Because that's the nickname. And that's the way the people in the first century who knew him, who learned from him, who worked alongside of him in the gospel, that's how they would refer to him, what they would have called him. And what's interesting to me is that when Rock writes this epistle, this letter to us, and shares too that we also, like our children's message talked about, have been chosen by God and been made for his purpose, and we've been given a new name, he doesn't call us Rock. And he says that we've come to Jesus, and he doesn't call Jesus Rock either. He calls him something different. He calls him a stone. Calls Jesus a living stone, and then says, we, like living stones, are being built up. And I know you're thinking to yourself, okay, rock, stone, what's the difference? It sounds all the same to me. Well, in one sense it is, but in another sense it's not, because a Petra, a Petros, is something that's rough, unfinished, uncut. It's a rock that you find lying on the ground. It might even be bedrock that you had built something upon, which is the metaphor that Jesus is drawing attention to in Matthew chapter 16, verse 17, when he says that to Peter, on this Petra I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. He's talking about building something upon Peter. So he's this unfinished rock that's there in the earth, and Jesus is going to build something upon that. And now, not upon the personality or the person of Peter, but upon Peter's confession of the Christ, which is what came right before that. Matthew chapter 16, verse 16. Peter's the first disciple to say, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus says, on that I'm going to build my church, on that Petra. But Peter also knows that his nickname, Petra, means unfinished, unsculpted, unpresentable rock. And so that's not what he calls Jesus in his epistle, and that's not what he calls us. He calls us Lithos. Lithos is the word for stone. Are you familiar with David? Now, I don't mean the Old Testament biblical character of David, David and Goliath David. I mean Michelangelo's David. Are you familiar with David? Well, I guess in some sense that is the Old Testament biblical figure of David. But it's a Renaissance sculpture of him. I was a science major in college, but I had to take art history class. Anybody else here have to do that, even though they weren't an art major? Sure. You take art history class. In art history class, I learned that Michelangelo didn't actually enjoy painting, even though his most famous work is probably the painting of the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. He never enjoyed painting. He only did that because he was sort of forced to do it by the Pope and was being paid to do it. And that's the only job he was being paid for at the time, and so he did it. But what he really enjoyed was sculpting. And so this is his most famous sculpture, the sculpture of David. 17 feet high, out of one solid piece of marble that weighs over 6 tons in its finished form. It is remarkable the way that he sculpted this and put so much detail into it that you can see the features on David's face, you can see the veins in his hands and the muscles in his neck. It's the figure of David just before he goes out to meet the giant Goliath. It's a remarkable piece of stone. That is a lithos. See, a lithos is a stone that's been quarried and chosen for a purpose. It's been sculpted, it's been shaped. It's not just a functional stone, but it's stone that has a purpose, that conveys a message. And this is what Peter says about you and me. It's a stone that has been put on display. Now, the statue of David's been on display for over 500 years now. It was sculpted around the turn of the 16th century. So over 500 years it's been on display. Now, if you want to go see it, you can go see it at there's a museum called the Galleria dell'Accademia in Florence, Italy. And you can go see it inside the museum. But before it was inside, it was outside. Modern curators are worried about the brittleness of the imperfections of the marble and that it could be prone to destruction if it's outside for too long. And so they've moved it inside. But for the first nearly 400 years of its existence, it sat outside on the palazzo outside the city hall of Florence, Italy. Sat outside in the sunlight. And this is what Peter is saying about you and me in 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 9 to 10. It says, you are a chosen race, a holy priesthood, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for God's own possession, so that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. That's who we are as living stones, people who've been especially quarried and set up in the light for this purpose, to proclaim the excellencies of our God. You know, Jesus once said to the religious leaders of his time, if these people who believe in me are silent, because the religious leaders are saying, Jesus, you need to silence your followers. He says, you know, if these people who believe in me are silent, then even the very rocks will cry out in praise of me. Luke chapter 19, verse 40. Even the very rocks will cry out. God has the ability to cause even the rocks of the ground, the Petra, that are just laying around, or even the bedrock, rock that's in the ground, unfinished, unformed, to call out his praises. But God would rather see that happen through you and me. Because God has chosen us, quarried us for that very purpose. He came and found us in the darkness of our underground quarry of humanity and pulled us out and set us up in the sunlight so that we would proclaim the excellencies of him who called us out of darkness into his marvelous light. That's God's plan for us as his people. You know, as we think about the sculpture of David, nobody looks at that magnificent sculpture and thinks, wow, what an amazing marble. How incredible. And they just admire the marble for the way it fractured in just the right places. How it broke in just that shape so that it made itself into this image of David. Nobody thinks that. No, you look at that piece of marble and you admire the sculptor who put years of work in. Michelangelo worked on this for more than 3 years, sculpting and shaping it into just that form to make it distinct and different from every other piece of marble in the rest of the world. This is what God is saying about you and me. That he's chosen us and quarried us specifically for this purpose, to be this kind of Lithos stone, that he has shaped, that he has sculpted, that people would not admire us, but it would cause people to admire him. So in our passage today, from 1 Peter chapter 2, if we drop down to verses 15 and 16, that's where Peter says, for this is the will of God, that by doing good you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. Live as people who are free. Not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but living as servants of God. You see, God's intention is that other people around us would see the good things that God is doing in us, and it would cause them to admire and give praise to God. They would admire the sculptor. Right now, we have a gift that Michelangelo's statue of David doesn't have, and no Petra in this world has. We have the gift of being able to speak, too. You see, God has not granted that gift to the rocks of this world. He could, but he has not had to, because God's people are not silent about him. Because his Lithos are living Lithos, and we speak out and celebrate and praise the excellencies of our God, who called us out of darkness into his light. That's you and me. Now, something else you may not have known about Michelangelo's David is that it wasn't always Michelangelo's. I don't know if you knew that, but there's another sculptor actually started it before him. Another sculptor before him roughed out the torso and the vague shape of the legs, may have even put in the splits that formed the two separate legs, made the hole between his legs, and then stopped working on it for some reason. And this enormous stone, probably in its unfinished form, 8 to 10 tons, was just laying, toppled on its side in the cathedral workshop. It just kind of in the dark, there in Florence, Italy. There it is, toppled on its side. No one's looking at it. It's not conveying any message. It's not proclaiming anything to anybody. It's just left derelict in the workshop for nearly a quarter of a century. You know, I think maybe sometimes we begin to feel that way about ourselves, too. See, it's a shame that a stone that was that expensive and that difficult to obtain, you know how hard it would be to quarry a stone that size and move it all the way to Florence, Italy, and this beautiful stone, that it would just sit there, unused, not doing anything, not out in the light, not being shown off. It's a shame that it would sit there for a quarter century. It's a shame if that would happen to us, too. But sometimes we begin to feel like that. We begin to feel like, well, okay, if, as Peter says, we are this chosen people that God has pulled out to use for this special purpose, to sculpt us and make us something, well, he sure left us in a sorry state. See, we begin to think that way or get that mind about ourselves when things are going difficult in life, or when work is a struggle, or when our loved ones aren't returning our affections, or when all those aches and pains of life have escalated into serious diagnoses, and we begin to think that maybe God has just tossed us aside and forgotten about us for a time, which would really be a shame. And worse yet, we sometimes wonder if maybe that's because of our imperfections. Modern curators did not know what the sculpture of David exactly was made of, what kind of marble it was made of, until recent years. It was about 28 years ago, something like that, that a rogue museum guest had smuggled in a hammer under his clothes into the museum and lunged at Michelangelo's statue with his hammer in full swing and knocked off one of the toes. And when he knocked off the toe, then, well, they were able to put it back, because before he got another swing in, all the other museum guests tackled him and held him down until the guards got there and took him away. But that little bit of the toe that was knocked off, that they were able to put back, researchers were able to study and look at the core of the marble that Michelangelo made the statue out of, and they were able to look at the microscopic imperfections in that marble and determine where it came from. They were able to pinpoint the place in the Alps where the quarry was, and they were able to determine the ancient quarry that it was brought out of, all because of those imperfections. You know, God doesn't have to wait until life has shattered us to pieces to determine the imperfections that are going on in our life, or to see those. God already knows them from the start, from the time he chose us. He knew what those imperfections were. He knew what they were for Peter. He knew Peter was a foul-mouthed fisherman, forward enough to tell Jesus that he would never have to die on the cross. He knew Jesus was that Peter was a dopey disciple, drowsy enough to fall asleep 3 times, even though Jesus had commanded them to stay awake and pray with him on the night when he was betrayed. He knew Peter was a volatile vigilante, violent enough to swing his sword and cut off the ear of the servant of the guard when Jesus was being arrested. He knew that Peter was a calloused coward, cold enough to deny Jesus 3 times that night when Jesus was on trial. He knew all these imperfections of Peter. And these imperfections are more than just microscopic imperfections on the inside. How is it that Jesus can say, on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it? And Jesus knew that about him from the start. Jesus knows that about you and me too. Are you foul-mouthed? Maybe not a fisherman, but like Peter, saying things that probably shouldn't be said at times? Jesus knows that. Are you a dopey disciple? Do you struggle in your prayer life, repeatedly falling asleep when you should be instead cultivating your prayers? Jesus knows that too. Are you a volatile vigilante like Peter? Are you prone to flying off the handle at times? Jesus knows that as well. Are you a callous coward, afraid to speak about your relationship with Jesus? Jesus knows that too. He knows our imperfections, these and many, many more. Because Peter knows that Jesus knew that about him. Peter knows that Jesus knows that about us too. And Peter says that God has chosen us anyway. In fact, in verse 10 of the part that you recited today, 1 Peter 2, verse 10, Peter said, once you were not God's people, but now you are God's people. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. We have been quarried so that we might be shaped by the sculptor who is the master of mercy. If we kept reading in 1 Peter, if we went to chapter 3, verse 18, it says that he suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, to bring you to God. He was put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the spirit. 1 Peter 3:18. Now, if we were to put that into the language of 1 Peter chapter 2, it would mean that the perfect stone suffered for the imperfections of the imperfect Petros in order to bring us to God, so that we might be living stones. He was put to death but made alive so that we would be made alive. It's the story of his death and resurrection, and that story then becomes our story. This is what Peter is saying in 1 Peter chapter 2, a little bit later after our text in verse 24. For Peter says he himself bore our sins once in his body on the tree, so that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. You see, his death and resurrection story becomes our death and resurrection story, which is why Peter can now talk about us as living stones, because Jesus was the living stone, and now we are too. And so what's on display in our lives is no longer the imperfections of our life. It's God's sculpted work in our life. We're no longer the Petra that we once were. We're now the living Lithos. We're the ones who have been sculpted and shaped, and what is seen in our lives are the amazing things that God is doing so that others might admire that and proclaim the excellencies of him who called us out of darkness into his light. Now, I'm not saying that God's finished with you. I'm not saying God's finished with me yet either, but far be it from us to just become content the way we are. As if we are just sitting toppled in a workshop somewhere, that God has been done with us and thrown us off to the side. And think, well, this is just the way I am. When God has in mind for us to be so much more. That's what this Living Stones text is all about. And as we embarked on this Living Stones theme, about 6 years ago, here at Holy Cross, the Living Stones gathered here, who worship here, have put forth just in this effort almost $1 million. We've been tracking that on this puzzle with the face of Jesus in the back. You may have seen it as you're leaving. It's right on the left side as you walk out the doors. You may have seen that puzzle, and the face of Jesus has been growing in that puzzle. And that denotes the $1 million that we've given to that Living Stones theme. in the last 6 years. And it's only about half done. We've got about half of that still to go to finish that painting, or that puzzle image of Jesus. But all that Living Stones funds have been given so that we could expand our facility. And when we did that, expanded the facility, we carved out a section of that to be a workshop, where artisans could come in and they could teach their talents, and at the same time, other people who came and participated could learn that they've been chosen by God and they're being sculpted by Him too. We've called it Cross My Art. And it's been going on since 2013 when it first launched. And in it, we've always taken volunteer artists. All the artists who do this are volunteers who love Jesus and love art and want to put the two of those together to help other people learn about Jesus too. Now, we haven't taken up yet Michelangelo's favorite style of art. We haven't done any sculpting of marble lately. But yesterday, they were doing these. These are fused glass garden stakes. Just beautiful artistic work that they were doing. And one of the instructors who was doing this said that she just loves to see people's hidden talents as they begin to do this and see what they come up with in this art. The hidden talents of lots of people. Just in the last spring, just this spring of 2017, more than 60 people have participated in our Cross My Art classes. And of those, more than 60% of them have been from the community outside and around Holy Cross. But most importantly, not only were they making garden stakes and people were seeing their creativity and the hidden talents that others have, they were learning about these garden stakes that just like these garden stakes are not going to make their garden grow, there's got to be God in the picture who makes things grow in their garden. The same thing's true with us in our faith. We can't make our faith grow. We can't even start it or plant the seed. But God's the one who makes faith grow in our life in the news of the death and resurrection of Jesus, which Jesus talked about in John chapter 12, being like a seed that's put in the ground, and when it grows, it bears fruit. And Paul talked in 1 Corinthians chapter 2 about how, it's 1 Corinthians chapter 3, about how he planted and Apollos watered, but it is God who gives the growth. And that's what's happening in our lives too. But these garden stakes do something pretty cool. They draw people's attention to what's going on in the garden. Other people are going to notice the plants in the garden because they're going to notice these. And it's going to draw attention to it. And that's what happens in our lives. We are here to draw attention to the work that God is doing in our lives. Or to put it in the words of 1 Peter chapter 2, to proclaim the excellencies of Him who called us out of darkness into His marvelous light. I have a couple other things up here that have been made in recent years in our Cross My Art workshop. And we didn't just expand that facility and carve out that space so that we could make cool stuff, although some of this is pretty neat. But instead we did it so that we would have a workspace, a venue, a way to talk to the community outside of Holy Cross about Jesus, how God has chosen them and is beginning to sculpt them as well into His image, so that they too would recognize that they are these living stones being sculpted and precious and chosen by God in Christ Jesus our Savior. That is the song that we get to sing. And if we, living Lithos, if we stones won't do it, then the Petros stones will. So will you sing that song with me? In Jesus' name.